Let's be honest, by now I'm sure we've all tried the Mythic Weekly Story mission, and let's be completely honest, these missions are genuinely a little bit difficult, mainly because these enemies hit so hard, and all of the, yellow bars or mini-bosses are just absolute bullet sponges, and you have to sit there for 35 plus minutes just shooting a primary weapon at it to eventually get it down and, kill it. Now, all of these builds that are circling around the edge of fate, you've got the Warlocks with Starfire, you've got these Hunters with the melee grapple, Titans with their hammer, whatever it is, all these builds are great, but when it really comes down to it, in these mythic missions, all of these builds are completely useless. I'm just going to be completely honest. None of these builds are going to work in any of these mythic missions, purely because these bosses hit so hard and they are such bullet sponges that none of these builds will work, and these ability cooldowns will just run out before the boss dies. However, there is one build today that I'm going to run you through if you're a Warlock main that will definitely help you carry yourself through these mythic missions. We can all safely agree that these bosses are bullet sponges, and the best way to complete these missions are just to sit back, stay safe, stack damage resistance, weaken the boss, and just chug away at the boss in a safe spot until it eventually dies. Now, this build for the Warlock, I will admit, is nothing new. We've had this build before, and it still carries out to be one of the best Warlock builds in the entire game, and if you've ever played Warlock since the final shape came out, you will know exactly what build I'm talking about, and that is the Getaway Artist Prismatic Warlock subclass. This build is hands down the best, damage resistance, survivability sort of build that the Warlocks can get their hands on at the moment, and unfortunately, this build still carries as one of the best builds for the Warlock subclass. So if you haven't heard of this build, or if you haven't tried it, this is definitely one of the builds for you. I've just spent the past hour doing, weekly mythic missions, and I will admit, these missions are very hard, and they will still take you a very long time, but this build will definitely shave off about half of that time needed to, finish these missions. So the main loop of this build, and the main exotic that we're going to be running, is the Getaway Artist Warlock Gauntlets. Now, this exotic perk reads, you convert your Arc Grenade into an Arc Soul and become amplified. The Arc Soul functions as an autonomous turret. By running an Arc Grenade in the Prismatic subclass, this allows us to consume our grenade and create an Arc Buddy, while also making us amplified. Both of these two things are very, very important in this Warlock build. Straight away, this Arc Buddy that we have is like a free gun. This thing's going to follow you around and just shoot anything that it can see in your, perspective. And this buddy will also proc Devour for you, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, another key factor to this build is by running the Bleak Watcher aspect. This reads, hold to convert your grenade into a stasis turret that fires slowing projectiles at nearby targets. Now, these two perks work very well together. First of all, with the Getaway Artist, we consume our grenade and we get an Arc Buddy. But as we consume our grenade, it will also spit out a Bleak Watcher turret, which will act as a turret and freeze enemies in front of you. So you're getting a 2-in-1 bonus here, technically 3 if you count yourself as being amplified. So just by consuming your Arc Grenade, which we will be running in the Prismatic subclass, we are getting 3 benefits here. We're getting the Arc Buddy, we're getting a Bleak Watcher turret, and we are also being amplified. Now, intrinsically, being amplified as a Guardian will give you a 15% damage reduction, which is just amazing and very, very needed in these mythic missions. Now, the other aspect we are going to be running is Feed the Void, just by far the best Warlock aspect we can run. Feed the Void acts as a Devour ability. Defeating a target with any ability in our toolset will proc Devour. Once Devour is procced, killing anything with weapons or more abilities will extend the duration of Devour. Now, like I said earlier, having an Arc Buddy counts as an ability. So if your Arc Buddy does kill something, which is more than likely, this will proc Devour on you. If your Bleak Watcher turret kills something by, getting that last hit with a slow shot, that will proc Devour. If you kill something with your grenade, it will proc Devour. Any abilities in our toolset will proc Devour. And then once Devour is procced, we can keep it up extremely easy by getting weapon kills. As for our melee, you definitely want to be running Arcane Needle. This gives you 3, powerful melees that allows you to proc Devour whenever you need. So in a crunch, an enemy's low, you quickly throw out an Arcane Needle, it will kill it, you then proc Devour, you get healed to full, and you can easily keep this loop up. Now, as for the super, I definitely run Song of Flame. This is by far one of the best, supers in the game for Warlocks. Not only does it give you a massive damage resistance, but it gives you a tool set of increased grenade and melee regeneration, and this does a lot of damage to bosses. Not to mention it makes you radiant, so your weapons do more damage, it scorches, it can cause ignitions. Song of Flame is definitely by far the best super to be running for, especially these mythic missions. Now let's move on to the 4 fragments. Now this build did get slightly nerfed since the final shape, because Bungie took away one of our fragment slots, so we've gone down to only 4 fragments, which makes it very important to pick the 4 correct fragments. Now, starting off with Facet of Courage. This is by far one of the best fragments that we need to run, which really makes the build. It reads, your Arc, Solar, and Void abilities deal increased damage to targets afflicted with a Darkness debuff. Now, our whole toolset is built around Arc, Solar, and Void abilities. Now, in our toolset, we have 2 ways to apply a Darkness debuff to said target. First of all, we have our Arcane Needles. This is extremely easy. If you hit an enemy with it, it's going to unravel them, causing a Darkness debuff on them. Not to mention, if we have a Bleak Watcher turret up, it's going to slow them, which will also count as a Darkness debuff. So either of these 2 tools will apply that Darkness debuff, and then all of our Arc, Solar, and Void abilities will do increased damage to these targets. For obvious reasons, you want to make sure all of our targets are Darkness debuffed, because we have an Arc Soul doing Arc damage, we have Song of Flame doing Solar damage, and then if we are in Transcendence, our grenade does Void damage. So all 3 of these damage sources will do increased damage as long as our targets are Darkness debuffed. Moving on to our next fragment, we have Facet of Dawn. Powered melee hits against targets makes you radiant. Powered melee final blows will make you and your allies radiant. Now this is just a simple on-use fragment. Basically, we're using our Arcane Needles to create us Devour, but in the process we may as well take this Prismatic Fragment to also make us radiant, granting us a free 20% increased weapon damage. This is very, very important, especially in these bullet sponge scenarios on these bosses. When they just take so many shots, we may as well get a free 20% damage boost whenever we can. Moving on to our third fragment, we have the Facet of Dominance. Your Void grenades weaken targets, and your Arc grenade jolt targets. Now this fragment is purely built around our Transcendence. Whenever we go Transcendence, we get our Transcendence grenade, which does both Void and also stasis damage. So as a Warlock with this fragment on, this is our easiest way to weaken enemy targets. You go Transcendence, you chuck out your Void and Stasis grenade, and it's going to go ahead and weaken the enemy target. Now Weaken is by far one of the strongest debuffs in the game, and whenever we can weaken any enemy bosses or mini bosses, we should definitely be doing this. When an enemy is weakened, it allows them to take up to 15% increased damage, and considering this build revolves around getting Transcendence extremely fast, we can constantly be weakening enemies and also making ourselves radiant. So these 2 paired together, 20% increased damage, and the enemy takes 15% increased damage. It's a lot of damage being output there. And moving on to our 4th fragment, which is technically an optional fragment. You can sub this one out if you feel like it, but I like to run Facet of Purpose here. Picking up an Orb of Power grants either Bolt Charge, Restoration, Frost Armor, Woven Mail, or an Overshield based on the damage type of your equipped super. So because we are running Song of Flame, we are going to be getting Restoration every single time we pick up an Orb of Power, which is extremely, extremely useful. Now, like I said, this one is situational, so you can sub this one out for another fragment. And the other fragment that I would run, especially for these mythic activities, is Facet of Protection, which basically just gives you a decent damage resistance buff whenever you are surrounded by enemies. And then obviously if you are Transcendent, it's going to increase this damage resistance amount. But that basically sums up all the aspects, fragments, and what exotics we're running. So let's jump into the very, very simple rotation loop that you need to be doing whenever you come into contact with enemies. First of all, you want to consume your grade instantly and create yourself an Arc Buddy and also that Bleak Watcher turret. This is going to make you amplified, giving you a damage resistance. It's going to give you multiple sources to proc Devour, and from here on out you just kill enemies and stay in cover. You want to save your Arcane Needles for any emergency situation when you need to melee enemies to proc Devour, but the build is extremely simple. All you have to do is just consume your grenade whenever you get a grenade back from, the recharge rate. You never want to throw out your Storm Grenade unless there's some sort of emergency situation or you need some quick damage. Always be consuming that grenade and creating a Bleak Watcher turret. When you get Transcendence, make sure you are chucking your grenade at any enemies that need to be weakened, as this is very, very important. Now let's jump into 2 guns that I heavily recommend using in these mythic missions that make this build even better. First of all, because these enemies are complete bullet sponges, I definitely recommend running the Polaris Lance and also the Tenacious Mastery. The Polaris Lance paired with the Artifact Anti-Barrier Scout Rifles will make all these missions extremely easy. If you ever come up against a Hydra with a shield, your Polaris Lance will shoot right through it, and it will also grant you a huge amount of light Transcendence energy, and it is also a featured exotic, making it do even more damage. Polaris Lens is an amazing weapon. Pairing this with the Tenacious Mastery being a stasis gun, this will be your source of darkness energy for your Transcendence bar, not to mention your Bleak Watcher turret will also build that bar up for you naturally. Now just to quickly, one artifact perk that is very, very important this season is Fever and Chill. Running a solar weapon and a stasis weapon is very important. Getting rapid precision hits with this solar weapon, being the Polaris Lance, will grant you Radiant, and then granting rapid precision hits with your Tenacious Mastery being stasis will grant you Frost Armor, and all these buffs are just anything you can take while doing a mythic mission is very important, make it just that much easier. But anyway, that will pretty much wrap that build up there. If you haven't been using the Getaway Artist Exotic Warlock build, I definitely recommend you give it a try this season, especially when you dive into these harder missions like the Mythic campaign missions, which just take a tremendous amount of time. This build will definitely help you by, granting you Radiant, weakening the enemies, and giving you massive damage resistance and survivability. But again, thank you for watching. I'll leave a link down below to the dim link of this build. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Later.